Hi, my name is Rick, and this is my business communications final project. We were asked to do our project on a social or business issue. Mine kind of spans both. Mine is LGBT discrimination, the balance between equality and religious freedoms. So definitely a social issue because we're dealing with social rights. Definitely a business issue because lately, or the last few years, we've been hearing a lot in the news about particularly business owners using their religious freedoms as a reason to enforce some discriminatory policies in the workplace. So let's get started. So right now on Capitol Hill, politicians are currently debating the Equality Act to decide whether or not to expand the Civil Rights Act to include LGBTQ people. The big debate seems to be about trying to ensure that LGBTQ people aren't being discriminated against, while also ensuring that sincerely held religious beliefs and rights are not violated. We all grew up learning that all men are created equal and equal protection under the law. I mean, that's our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And unfortunately, LGBTQ people are not equal under the law and seem to not be created equal, although we all are. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination on a few key characteristics: race, color, religion, sex, national origin. Since 1964, that law has been amended several times to include other groups of people. Just like in 1990 with ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, disabilities were put into that law to ensure that they were given those protections as well as reasonable accommodations in the workplace. So like I said, it's been amended several times. LGBTQ Americans still, unfortunately, are not protected under federal law. So the Equality Act of 2019 would essentially amend some existing laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, like we just talked about, the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Jury Selection and Services Act. Now that act ensures that juries, when we are in trial, if you're a part of the LGBTQ community, that our jury represents us, right? Just like back in the day when Black people go to trial and their jury would be filled with white people. This would protect us in the courtroom as well, ensuring that we're given some of those same protections and a jury that is representative of who we are. The Equality Act would also amend several other laws regarding employment within the federal government. I think one of the most interesting parts about the Equality Act, though, is the fact that it would redefine what is considered a public accommodation by adding in some additional things like retail stores, services like banks and legal services, and transportation. And what's particularly interesting is this update would apply to all other groups protected under these existing laws as well. So it's not just LGBTQ people being impacted by this part of it. It's all other people protected under these, as well as the businesses that will now be included. So how will it affect the LGBTQ community? Well, as you can see by this map, all of the red are states that do not have statewide LGBTQ protections. The gray states that you see are ones that do. So if you took a drive from Maine to California and you were LGBTQ, your rights would change quite a few times. Not to mention that within some of these red states that don't have statewide protections, some municipalities like counties and cities have protected or put in some ordinances to protect LGBTQ citizens. So in Michigan, for example, Detroit and Grand Rapids, as well as a few other cities, do have some ordinances to protect LGBTQ people, but the state as a whole doesn't, and the country as a whole doesn't, which is why we have this patchwork of civil rights laws protecting or not protecting LGBTQ people. So by passing the Equality Act and having a uniform policy regarding LGBTQ people, that would obviously be a big change. It also addresses three key areas, as well as some other ones, but three key ones: work, housing, and public accommodation. So right now in this country, if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, you can still be fired from your job for your sexual orientation or gender identity. A landlord could deny you a lease if he feels like it violates his religious freedoms. Banks can even deny you mortgages for a house, believe it or not. Public accommodations would be like the cake case in Colorado, where the owner of the bakery refused to make a cake for a gay couple because he felt like it violated his religious beliefs. So getting into some of those business owner relationship with religion, different things like that, a big part of understanding is she was understanding the different types of business ownership, right? So there's several main types: sole proprietorships, partnerships, LLCs, corporations, and nonprofits. So sole proprietorships, partnerships, and LLCs are, for the most part, one and the same with their companies. They're not separate entities. They're not treated that way under the law. Whereas corporations and nonprofits are treated as separate entities, even if only one person owns the company or a majority stake, or even if it's just a few people, they're still considered separate entities if they're a corporation or a nonprofit. So this is important for what we'll get into in a few moments. So the free exercise clause acts as a protection from government intrusion into the religious practices of individuals in the United States. So if you're a religious entity or religious business, for the most part, things like the Equality Act would not apply to you. You could choose to violate it unless you accept state or federal funding. As we've seen recently, this past month, for a long time, adoption agencies in the state of Michigan would accept state funding, but then would not follow some state policies because they're a religious entity. Just within the last month, the state said, no, if you're going to accept religious funding, and follow up the policy. If you don't want the funding, then you're still free to do what you want because you're a religious organization. So we're seeing some changes there, and some starting to maybe hold some businesses accountable, see that it's not really a violation of religious freedom if you're accepting state money, because the separation's kind of already kind of in the gray area, right? But other than that, there's typically the separation between person and business in a corporation or a nonprofit, except when corporate personhood comes into play. And corporate personhood is something that has kind of come alive in the last few decades, and it's through multiple court cases, different legislative pieces that have over time given corporations more and more rights, right? Because in general, the Constitution applies to individuals, to people, not to businesses and entities. So in the case of the cake case in Colorado being a sole proprietorship, if the Equality Act were to pass, that may or may not apply to him because he's one and the same with his business. He might still be able to choose to discriminate. In general, corporations aren't allowed to, except when corporate personhood comes into play. Because corporate personhood is when the law allows a corporation to be recognized as an individual, bringing with it rights and liberties generally enjoyed by humans. Now, most scholars think that courts have set bad precedent by allowing corporations to have some of those rights that are typically reserved constitutionally for people. A great example of this would be the Hobby Lobby case a few years ago. They denied birth control to one of their employees on their corporate health care plan because they believed it violated their religious liberties and the religious values of the company. Except companies can't have religious values because they're companies, not individuals with a belief system. But the courts actually sided with Hobby Lobby and said because it was a closely held corporation, meaning that there were only a few owners, that the values could encompass the company as a whole, and they could enforce something like the birth control, not being able to purchase that on the health, or not covering it on their health insurance. So what does this mean? What do we recommend? Well, a good first step is passing the Equality Act, ensuring that LGBTQ Americans are protected nationwide and we don't have the patchwork of laws throughout the country where your rights might change as you travel. So a good first step is passing the Equality Act. But no Civil Rights Act will truly be effective if we don't first reestablish the legal separation between the entity and the owner. We need to get on the same page as far as what businesses fall under religious liberty and where they can apply that as a reason to discriminate, and which ones don't. And then solving this corporate personhood thing where we step back and say, do businesses, or do they not, get the same rights as human beings? Some important things there to make sure that civil rights are enacted in the most effective way possible. Now, this chart here shows the support for non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. 71% of all Americans say that they would like to see protections for LGBTQ people. 61% of Republicans, 73% of independents, and 78% of Democrats. So that's a bulk of America. We seem to all be pretty much on the same page there. Just for reference, in American politics, we're typically right around 50-50. So being at 71% is an incredibly high number. So I think we're at a great place to finally start passing some civil rights for the LGBTQ community, while also reestablishing some of these business laws, because this really is a social and a business issue. Thank you so much.